right, let's go ahead and wrap up our fourth and final part of the video lecture for chapter number 19, which is all about the Islamic Gunpowder Empires. So, let's talk about decline, because only one out of these three empires is going to survive, or two out of three, is going to survive past the early modern era. The Mughal Empire is going to last all the way into the 1800s, where they're going to fall to the British Empire. The Safavid Persian Empire is going to collapse in the 1700s. And then the only one that survives all the way into the 20th century, into the 1920-something, 1923 or so, is going to be the Ottoman Empire. So let's talk about why these are all declining. What is weakening these empires? Number one reason is crappy rulers. As it has been for almost all of world history. When you have crappy rulers, your empire is gonna go down. And how do you get crappy rulers? Well, the culture of these empires is partly to blame. Remember we mentioned earlier in the previous video how the heirs to the throne, right, the next generation of rulers would live in these harems with their mothers and their siblings, and they're going to be isolated from the rest of the world. And therefore, they are going to lack the experience in running the government. So you live your whole life just sitting around and chilling and hanging out with your siblings and your parent and your mom, and you barely see your dad, and your dad suddenly dies and you have to kill your brothers, and boom, you're the emperor, you're the sultan. And you have no preparation for it. But you do have a lot of bureaucrats, you have a lot of administrators, you have a lot of ministers, and they're going to tell you what to do, right? And you're going to do it because you have no experience. But because the government, it depends on you, because this is a absolute monarchy. If you're a crappy ruler, then all those bureaucrats, all those administrators, all those ministers, they're going to slowly do whatever they want. So you have a kind of like a generational problem here, that you might have an awesome ruler like Akbar or Suleiman or Shah Abbas, right? These are awesome rulers. But then you have the next generation and they're weak. And the next generation is a little bit weaker and a little bit weaker and a little bit weaker. And the government grows a little bit more corrupt, right? And problems keep kind of like pounding on and pounding on and pounding on, right? So that harem culture, leaving inexperienced, weak rulers, and that weak rulers leads to more corruption. On top of that, you have internal and external conflicts. Right, this time period we see the rise of Europe, right, the West. Europe is slowly progressing and making itself a bigger and bigger player in the affairs around the world, right? And they definitely control the Americas. They're definitely, having an advantage in Africa with the slave trade, right? And even though there's no way, Europe is going to conquer these Islamic empires, at least not yet, Europe is slowly getting there. They're making their way into ruling these empires, right? Little by little, breaking down these empires bit by bit by bit. And as Europe is progressing and becoming more and more technologically advanced, not only with gunpowder, with methods of production, right? Eventually we see the Industrial Revolution take place in Europe first, but other stuff like the printing press, right? And scientific tools for like astronomy and stuff, right? And Europe is, getting a greater understanding of this world of science and of technology. And in the Middle East, when the Europeans show up and they say, look, we have telescopes, we have a printing press, we have all this cool stuff that you might want to use. The Islamic Empire say, no, we don't like it. We don't need it. We already know everything. We've studied everything. Everything's in the Quran, right? So there's going to be a religious opposition to progress, religious opposition to technological advancements, right? And the reason why these religious leaders don't want this new technology is because this new technology might pose a threat to their power. Remember what happened with the printing press in Europe, right? The printing press in Europe led to the division between the Protestants and the Catholics. It led to the Protestant Reformation. So if that's happening in Europe, right, and you're a religious leader in Ottoman Turkey or in Safavid Persia, you don't want the printing press there. You don't want those problems. You don't want people questioning religious authorities, because religious leaders, of course, are upper class. They have stuff to lose. So there is growing tensions and conflicts between the modernization of the world, modernization of Turkey and Persia and India, versus keeping things traditional, things the way they've always been, right? And unlike in Europe, where you have a strong middle class of merchants who are pushing forward for progress, there is no middle class to push forward in progress. Military and religion rules the day, upper class, in these empires. So they're going to put a halt to it. They're going to stop it. They're going to restrict it. And they're going to fight to keep things the way they are, because they're benefiting when things are the way they are. But even within these empires, we see, again, more conflicts, right? Especially with the Ottomans. We see that in Arabia, they are going to look at the Ottomans and say, these Ottomans are horrible people, horrible rulers. We don't like to be under them. So there's going to be a lot of religious conflicts between more super conservative Muslims versus less conservative Muslims. And that's going to lead to persecution, right? These religious conflicts lead to persecution. And just like it did, the wars of religion and the 30-Year War in Europe, same thing's going to happen in the Middle East, right? The Safavids, right? They're going to persecute other Muslims, right? Any Muslims who is a Sunni Muslim, they're going to persecute, non-Muslims if they have to, because they want to have this one religion for one people, uniting everyone together. And in India, we see that leaders emperors like Aurangzeb, he's going to persecute Hindus, burn down churches, burn down Hindu temples, and in their ruins build mosques. And the only thing that does is piss off the Hindus, which is bad because the Hindus are the vast majority of the root people. All right, so sectarian, right? Between the Sunni violence, right? Between the Sunni sect and the Shia sect, that's going to cause problems, right? The Ottomans and the Safavids are going to fight each other all the time, right? Because they can't put aside their religious differences. Heck, they still don't, put aside their religious differences, right? And in India, the Hindu majority is going to get mad at the Mughal rulers, right? And think what's going to happen when the British show up. But when the British slowly start making their way into India, the Hindus are going to look at the British and say, hey, help us take out the Mughals. And it's a match made in heaven, between Hindu leaders and the British Empire. Other problems. Let's keep adding on to these problems. Foreign trade. Europeans will have more and more control over foreign trade, right? And especially when it comes to firearms. These are gunpowder empires, and when they were formed, they had awesome guns. But by the 1700s, the Europeans have the best guns. And if you want to compete against your neighbors and compete against the Europeans, you got to get the best guns too. So they're going to be more dependent on Europe. And therefore Europe is going to say, okay, you want the guns, you got to give us, a good price. And Europe will control trade, right? So even though, again, Silk Road is still up and running, but maritime trade is going to be dominated around the world by Europeans. Military problems, these empires are constantly expanding, constantly fighting, right? And if taxes are not paid, then soldiers are not paid, and soldiers will rebel. And this happened in with the Janissaries, right? The Janissaries rebel against the Sultan, which is crazy because remember, they were supposed to be super, super loyal to the Sultan of the Ottomans. And the Janissaries, hold them hostage and say, give us money or else. Not only that, these empires, especially the Safavids and the Ottomans, they fight each other over and over for the same land, right, throughout, Mesopotamia. So it's not like they're conquering and expanding and bringing in all these new, sources of wealth and money and resources. They're fighting over the same land over and over. So these are unproductive wars. It's not like you're fighting and expanding and getting more money. You're fighting and spending money, and you're not getting anything in return, or barely anything in return. So lots of spending, wasting of money on military wars. And when the military doesn't get paid, they rebel, and that causes political instability. Technology, I've been talking about this. They fall behind technologically. They don't develop at the same rate as the Europeans are, right? And it's actually, again, it goes back to religion as well. So I mentioned earlier that Jews who were expelled from Spain, they come to live in the Ottoman Empire. They're invited by the Sultan, come live here. And these Spanish, Jewish people, they're educated, they're smart, because, they used to live in Al-Andalus being, super advanced for its time, right? Muslim Spain. And one of the things that they bring with them is the printing press. But the Ottomans, they said, no, you can't print stuff in Arabic. You can't print stuff in Turkish. You can't print the Quran, because the Quran has to be handwritten, right? Which means that knowledge and ideas are not going to spread. They're not going to diffuse throughout these empires as they had done in Europe. So there's not going to be an enlightenment in these empires. There's not going to be a scientific revolution in these empires. There's not going to be a commercial revolution in these empires, because they're so stuck to their old ways that they don't want to change. And it makes sense. If everything's been good for a long time, why change it, right? But Europeans, they're changing the world, and these people are kind of like falling behind. So the Europeans, when they go to the Middle East, when they go to India, when they go to the Islamic empires, right, they're going to bring their scholars, their scientists, right, their physicians, and they're going to study from the Muslims. They're going to study from these Islamic empires. They're going to study and learn math and science and medicine. And then they're going to take all those advancements, and they go back home to Europe, and they're going to, use it. And they're going to expand on it. And they're going to bring their ideas and mix it with the Muslims' ideas, over and over and over, making it better, more advanced, more smarter. And remember, the Europeans, the only reason they're exploring in the first place, the only reason, Portuguese explorers like da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz and Spanish explorers like Columbus, the only reason they're able to set sail is because Europeans had learned from the Middle East and from China, right? They adopted these new technologies. They adopted the learning. But now that the Europeans are sailing to the Middle East and sailing to the Islamic Empire, right? The Islamic Empire says, no, these guys are behind us because they're not Muslim, because they're not as rich as us, because they're not as advanced as us. They have nothing to teach us. We have nothing to learn from them, right? And they kind of close off their minds to the possibilities that the Europeans are developing stuff and advancing stuff that they can't even consider. So Islamic empires refuse to learn from the Europeans. And again, let's think about the historical context. Right before this time period, Europe was in the Dark Ages. Europe was during the post-classical era. Europe was feudal Europe, isolated Europe, right? And the Islamic Empire, with the Caliphate, they were super advanced, right? So when we talk about these Islamic empires, they still think they're super advanced, right? And they still think the Europeans are backwards. So of course you're not going to want to learn from these backward Europeans. What do they have to offer? Nothing. right? But with that closed mind mentality, they're going to fall behind, right? Again, dominate maritime trade. The Europeans are going to dominate, right? The Mughals, they don't even have a navy. They stopped sending ships to trade. And this is crazy because remember, India used to be the center of the Indian Ocean Trade Network, right, where they're trading left and right. But now they don't even have a navy. Safavids don't have a navy either, so they don't have maritime trade. The Ottomans had a navy, right? And in the Eastern Mediterranean, they controlled it, right? They had the monopoly, right, with the Venetians. But Indian Ocean Trade Network, boom, they got kicked out. The Europeans took them out. The Portuguese took them out. So the increase of maritime trade is going to fall under the control of the Europeans. And these land-based gunpowder empires, they're going to still control land routes. They're going to control the Silk Road. But the Europeans are not going to use the Silk Road anymore, right? Not when they have direct trade, right, around the world. European technologies, again, much more advanced, right? And, they're going to be much more advanced. And this is going to give the Europeans an advantage in the next time period, as they're going to start conquering the world and colonizing the world. And the Safavids, again, they're going to be the first of the empires to fall. A lot of internal problems, religious conflicts, and weakening economy. So these are comparisons to these empires, right? Kind of breaking it down with the some of the spice categories. Right, here's some of the other comparisons. So these empires are going to weaken over this time period. By the 1750s, the Safavids are going to be gone. They're going to collapse. They're going to be invaded by Central Asian Turks again. The Mughal Empire, even though it's still up and running in 1750, they're going to be weakened, and the British are slowly going to make their way into that territory. And the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of this time period was probably the most powerful empire in Europe and a major empire of Asia, and had territories in North Africa. But by 1750, they're on their way down. They're going to be declining. So that's it. So that's the decline of the Gunpowder Empire, the rise and fall of the Gunpowder Empires. Thanks for watching. All our parts for chapter 19. Hope you learned, hope you enjoyed yourself, and now I hope you go to bed because it's probably super late because you waited till the last minute to do your homework like always. The truth hurts, I know. All right, see you next time.